Ride! 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 The British are coming! The British are coming! Get your armaments, men! The British are coming! The British are coming! Ride! Ride! Watch as Paul Revere rides across the state of Massachusetts as fast as he can to warn his countrymen that the British, the Redcoats, are coming and they do not have good intentions. One of the most famous moments in American history, a moment that you will undoubtedly read more about in your life, a moment that you will undoubtedly hear about time and time again. Paul Revere's famous ride across Massachusetts. And where was he going? Well, of course, to Lexington and Concord. You see, the British, they were not happy with the citizens of the American colonies, what today is known as the United States of America. They were not happy with the people living in the state, or at the time, the colony of Massachusetts. And they were actually declared the King of England. He declared that the citizens of the state or the colony of Massachusetts were in open rebellion. And he decided that the best course of action would be to confiscate their armaments, to take away their guns, because if they don't have guns and things escalate, well, they wouldn't be able to defend themselves. They wouldn't be able to fight back. So Paul Revere goes on his famous midnight ride in the middle of the night because it was a sneak attack from the British. They were going to sneak out in the middle of the night, go over to Lexington and Concord, and they were going to confiscate all of the guns held by the people of Massachusetts. But the colonists caught wind, and Paul Revere jumped on a horse, and he rode across the state of Massachusetts, screaming, "The British are coming!" Word spread, and all of the men, the militia, they got up and they ran and they got their armaments and they actually moved them. And they armed themselves, and they waited, and they found themselves staring down the most powerful army in the history of the world, face to face with the Redcoats, face to face with the British. Now, Old War, the way they used to fight is they would just line up across from each other, and they would point their guns at each other and ready, aim, and they'd stand there as someone fired a gun at you. I mean, just imagine how terrifying. Yet here they were, waiting for the British, and they stood face to face with the British, and they were ordered to stand down, to drop their arms. And then the shot heard round the world. One of the colonists opened fire, and then everybody opened fire. And to this day, history does not know the man who shot what has been termed the shot heard round the world, the shot that changed the world, because the British colonies would go to war, a revolution, against the King of England, Britain. So the question is, how do we get to this point? How do we get to the point where the American colonists, who, by all accounts, I mean, they were English, they were British themselves, was fighting against the English army of King George? Well, we have to go back a couple of hundred years, and you'll hear tales in your life. You'll hear people say, Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492, right? And in 1492, the European governments discovered the Americas. Now, that might not be exactly true, because there were Europeans, people from across the ocean, that had already been to the Americas, right? The Vikings are documented of having been there. So, but either way, let's just take that at face value. So let's say from 1492 that the Europeans gain a general awareness of this big continent of land. And here's the thing, it's completely unexplored, right? They don't know what's over there. It's dangerous. There's no road, there's no roads, there's no grocery stores. It's complete unknown. In fact, how many people have actually made the journey from Europe, from across an ocean, all the way across the ocean to the Americas? Sounds pretty dangerous, right? They didn't have planes back then. Well, look at this chart. And this is what their boats looked like. In the year 1492, It took 2 months, a 2-month boat ride across the ocean to get to the Americas, and that's if you're going to get there, right? I mean, your captain's never done the ride before. So these were dangerous trips. In the year 1620, it took 9.5 weeks, so almost 2 months. In the year 1700, the boat trip still took 6 weeks. And that's where we are on our timeline, right? We're in the 1700s. So we're talking about a 6-week trip across the ocean. In the year 1845, it took 14 days. By the year 1957, it only took 14 hours because by then they had invented planes, right? A much easier trip. And today you can get across the ocean in just a number of hours. So it's quite a difference. But it was a dangerous trip. So the people that went on this trip, what kind of people do you think they were? Well, many of them, they were fleeing persecution, right? They didn't like the situation that they had in England or in Europe, right? And they said, we don't like the king. We think he is tyrannical, meaning that he's a bully, which he doesn't respect our rights and our freedoms. And because of that, we're going to get on this boat for the next 2 months with a chance of getting a disease or shipwrecking and dying. And we're going to take that chance and we're going to go to a completely unexplored world with no grocery stores, no roads, no anything, because we long to be free. Who were these colonists? So from 1492 all the way until this moment, this was in 1775, hundreds of years we're talking about, you had people that really valued freedom. These people were merchants. They were shipsmen. They worked on boats. They fished. They traded, right? These were very, very capable men, capable of surviving out at sea for months at a time with no radio, no telephone. You can't pick anyone up and call for help. Yet they were able to do that. Think about that. They were farmers. They grew their own food. Very self-reliant. They were locksmiths and welders. They were capable of making things out of steel. They didn't have to go to the store and I need to go to Walmart and buy something. I need to go onto Amazon and buy something. They created their own infrastructure. They built their own roads. They built their own log cabins and their own homes. These were strong, capable men and women, farmers, merchants, locksmiths. They cared for their animals. They cared for each other. They sewed their own clothing. Everything they had, they made with their hands. These were incredibly self-reliant people who loved freedom, who gave up the luxuries and the security and the infrastructure of living across an ocean to come all the way to Americas for a taste, for a longing of that freedom, the ability to grow their own food and make their own clothing and make their own guns and everything they had, build their houses and build their log cabins, take care of their animals. This is what they wanted. You don't go to the store and buy shoes, they'd make their own shoes. And when they needed work, they didn't do what we're told to do today. Right? They didn't say, oh, well, you know, when you're 22, 23, 24 years old after college, maybe someone will hire you and you could push some paperwork around. No, they did apprenticeship. So you'd have a grown-up who knew how to make shoes, right? Look at the shoesmith. And then what you would do, maybe when you were 13 years old, is you would just go work for that man and be his apprentice. And he would teach you that skill, how to make shoes. And then you would just go one town over once you knew how to make the shoes, and you would start your own business. And in a few years, you take on an apprentice. Imagine how capable these people are, making their own clothing, right? Building their own houses with their hands, with blood, sweat, and tears. Raising their animals, growing their food. How capable were these men and women? Here they are cutting down trees and building their own homes. They can build anything with their hands. Here they were at the port, and you could see everyone has something that they made because everyone had a craft. And because of that, there was this great culture of business where people didn't think, oh, you know, maybe one day I'll get a job. Why would I do that? When I could learn to make things with my hands And then I could be my own boss and no one can tell me what to do because I care about freedom. I mean, imagine that. Imagine you develop a skill, maybe artwork, drawing, music, computer coding. Maybe you learn to build things with your hands, construction. Maybe you learn engineering. There are great programs where you can learn engineering right now, where you learn to build something with your hands, and then you just start making items, whatever you're passionate about. And then you don't have to get a boss, and no one could ever tell you what to do or how to live your life. A spirit. There is a spirit of the colonies. I wonder if that spirit lives a little bit inside of you. Well, let's move from 1492 all the way forward in history. The 1500s, the 1600s, the 1700s. And now we're in the 1750s. And what you're seeing here is a battle, or at least a painting of a battle, between the British, the Redcoats, the same guys that the colonists would be fighting here at Lexington and Concord. There was something in about 1750, right? Remember, the Battle of Lexington and Concord happened in 1775. So this is about 20 years before that. And about 20 years before that, we've moved forward in time all the way from 1492, 1500, 1600, 1700, 1750. And now the British are fighting the Indians because they're taking part in something that was called the French and Indian War, also referred to as the 7-Year War. So if someone says the 7-Year War, they might also be referring to the French and Indian War. But essentially, France and England, two countries, remember, we were a part of England. We were their colony. America was their colony. Two countries all the way across the pond, across the big ocean, were engaged in this 7-Year War, which lasted for like 20 years, but that's neither here nor there. And they're fighting each other really all over the world. And that fight, it wound up also taking place in the Americas. Because the colonies were established, but there was there was more land, unexplored land, so to speak, to the west. I mean, the Native Americans, the Indians, whatever you want to call them, they were there. France had taken some of that land, and then there wound up being disputes between England and France. And they said, you know what? Let's fight it out. And the American colonist would be called upon to help the English army fight against France and the Indians. It was actually the American colonists, the English, the Redcoats that you're seeing there, and the Iroquois Indian tribes were actually aligned with the English and the colonists, fighting against the French and other Indian tribes. And they would have this French Indian War, and after a few years, I think about 9 years of fighting, again, why'd they call it the 7-Year War? After 9 years of the French and Indian War, the French would surrender, and the English, the colonists, were able to win that war. But this is where the relationship between the American colonies, our founding fathers, our forefathers who came before us, they would have a schism with the English crown. And the reason for that? Money. Wars cost money. And the French and Indian War, the 7-Year War, left the English government in $130 million of debt. $130 million. But they're the government. Who are they in debt to? Now that is a great question. The bank, of course. The government of England borrowed $130 million from the banks, the Bank of England and the Dutch banks. And they had to pay that back. Make a mental note in this moment. No war is ever fought without funding from the banks. No war is ever fought without funding from the banks. And the banks have monumental control over not only this war, the French and Indian War, not only over the American Revolution, but every war fought in human history involves the banks. And a lot of historians will tell you that, but understand these people are immensely powerful, and we are going to learn more and more about them as we take more courses. So, English crown said, we have to pay for this. This is so expensive. Oh, I have an idea. All right, I have an idea. We'll tax the colonists. The King of England said, we'll just tax the colonists. What is a tax? Just whatever business the colonists are doing, right? So a tax is if you go to a restaurant, right, and the bill, it's $10 for a bagel and some orange juice, right? And you say, okay, $10 plus tax, right? So the tax might make the bill, instead of being $10, it's $12, and then those extra $2, right, those $2 of tax, they would go to the government, right? So the King of England says, all right, and the British Parliament, the English Parliament, which is their government, says, all right, we'll just tax the colonists. And they started by doing a sugar tax. Sugar was a big trading item of the day. I mean, think about it. Sugar's in everything, right? I mean, you guys probably love sugar. So they said, all right, every time the colonists buy or sell sugar, we'll just tax it. And it wasn't just sugar. It was also iron, lumber, which is wood, right? These are big things, right? They taxed all of this stuff, including sugar. They told the colonists, they said, you're not even allowed to sell your wood or your lumber and iron to any country other than to England, right? Because we want to make sure that other countries are buying lumber and iron directly from the homeland of England. And the colonists are like, there's a big disagreement here. And they said, listen, you wanted this French-Indian War. We didn't want this war. And there was a disagreement. And the King of England said, the French were right on your door, and they were a threat to you, and we stepped in. We sent our redcoats, our army in. We said, go kick the French and Indians behinds. And now you got to pay for it. Let the standoff begin. Well, not long after that, they would pass the Stamp Act. The English Parliament, the English king, right? They would pass the Stamp Act. And this was another tax. And they told the colonists, all right, we still have to pay for this war. What we're going to do is we are going to tax all your paper goods, essentially, more or less. And this included magazines, notebooks, playing cards, newspapers, books, anything on paper, especially business documents or legal documents, right? They said, we're taxing that. Now, what would that do to your business if all of a sudden, every time you used a piece of paper, you had to pay extra money for it? So the colonists were not happy about this, and the colonists, they were ready to resist. Now, I want you to think about communication in those days. How did they communicate? Because on the one hand, the Stamp Act was just it was just a tax, but on the other hand, you had the colonists who were already unhappy with the Sugar Act, and they were speaking out against it, and now they were told, oh, well, anytime you use a piece of paper, you're going to have to pay extra money on that. Well, for the average person that didn't have a lot of money, this made writing letters and doing that type of paperwork very expensive, very restrictive. It limited their means of communicating. This is how they communicated with one another. And the colonists considered this to be a direct attack on their speech. They were saying, you're not allowing us to communicate with each other about how much we don't like the Sugar Act and how much we don't like the Stamp Act. And this is a violation of one of our rights. Because the colonists had been upset about the limitations on their speech for some time now. Because there were instances throughout their history where they were told, you're not allowed to say certain things, and if you do, you might get arrested. We might take you for your speech and put you in a little cell, a little prison cell, and throw away the key. Scary, right? That's scary stuff. Think about that today. I mean, today, communication happens on the computer, right? More than with on paper, right? So today, we might communicate with each other via Twitter. We might communicate with each other via Facebook. We might communicate with each other via YouTube or with TikTok. Well, in the modern world today, this is our public sphere of conversation. And is our speech limited? I can give you one big example. I mean, the last president of the United States, Donald Trump, isn't allowed on Twitter and really isn't able to use these platforms, right? So regardless of politics and what you think of the guy or not, it's self-evident that these social media companies the modern sphere of conversation, they have immense power over our speech. So how are they limiting our speech? We're going to talk about that too. But back in the day of 1776, it was newspaper, it was written word, and the Stamp Act was a great attack on their free speech. The colonists, they were not happy about this because that history went back all the way to it went back further than this, but in 1644, the Parliament, or the government of England, actually passed an ordinance. They passed a law, essentially, saying that the colonists could not distribute any books that weren't approved by England. And the colonists didn't take well to that either. And this is a famous poem written by John Milton, 100 years before the Stamp Act, about free speech. And the reason I like to point that out is there was a spirit of free speech. The colonists did not like that the crown across the ocean was telling them, oh, you can't say that. They said 100 years earlier, more than 100 years earlier at this point, John Milton wrote a poem in defense of free speech after you tried to limit it to our grandparents. This is John Adams, the second president of the United States. And when he heard about the Stamp Act, he wanted to come out against it, but he was a little bit worried about what he would say because he might get arrested, right? So what did he do? He actually started publishing in magazines, publishing papers against the Stamp Act, telling his fellow colonists why they should oppose the Stamp Act, but he did it under a pseudonym. He did it under a fake name so that it would not be tracked back to him and he could avoid getting arrested. Well, this wasn't anything new. Many of you know Benjamin Franklin, right? He's the guy who's on the $100 bill. The $100 bill, that's his face. Well, his brother, James Franklin, years before the Stamp Act, was actually, he ran a newspaper. And James Franklin was arrested multiple times for using speech that was unauthorized by the powers that be. So these people had a very long history of opposing free speech, and the Stamp Act was a direct attack at that speech. And it's self-evident how worried they were about it because people like John Adams did publish their opposition under fake names, right? Well, at the time when the Stamp Act was passed, this man, Benjamin Franklin, was actually in England. He was in England when they passed the Stamp Act. And he was a well-respected man, so he was invited to speak in front of the English government, in front of Parliament. And he told them that they should repeal the Stamp Act because he knows the spirit of the American colonists, and they were going to boycott. And the colonists did plan to boycott. They said, repeal the Stamp Act of 1766. But what Ben Franklin said is, you have to understand, English Parliament, these people love freedom. These people are intelligent, and they have a spirit of freedom, but they are self-reliant, they are rugged individualists, and they are rooted in Christian community. And what that meant is that these people were very capable of being independent. Ben Franklin said, they don't need you, and they are going to boycott all of your British goods because they will make their own goods, because they will cut down their own trees and build their own houses, because they will make their own shoes, because they will sew their own clothing, because they will take care of their animals, because they will weld their own steel, because they will grow their own crops, and because they will take care of what they have to do on the high seas. He said, you can't put this tax on the colonists. They're going to boycott you. And Parliament, they said, oh, Benny, what do you think? Well, as it turns out, Ben was right. And the colonists were so effective in their boycotts of British goods. In fact, I believe there were only 2 British goods that they didn't boycott. One of them was fishing hooks, and I forget the other one. But they were so self-reliant that they boycotted essentially all goods from England, from Britain. And Parliament said, oh, you know what, we better repeal the Sugar Act and we better repeal the Stamp Act, right? So these were major battles. Now, when they repealed the Stamp Act, Parliament England created a new act called the Declaratory Act. And they only did that to save face. They said, in the Declaratory Act, they said, we have the same right to tax you as we have the right to tax people who live in England. The fight was on. The battle was on. And it would be a battle for sovereignty, for control. Who controls the destiny of the colonists in the America? Are they ruled by a foreign king across an ocean? Or do they get to determine their own future moving forward? I'm going to end this by reading you a book that I wrote. Because years later, in 1791, after the colonists had won the Revolutionary War, they beat back the English. The king said, "We surrender," right? George Washington was a hero, and the American colonies of England had become the United States of America. A few years after that, they passed something called the Bill of Rights. And in the Bill of Rights, it said, your freedom of speech, your right to free speech shall not be abridged. They said that the government cannot limit your free speech. And to this day, I mean, there's court cases and we'll talk about that, but to this day, that's generally the truth, that the government lacks the ability to stop you from using your free speech. But like the government of England back in the day, do you think the government today wants to limit your speech? You bet on it. They certainly do. But they do it in a different way. Charisma Cat had a wicked idea. Take the fawns from all the deer. I will have complete control of how the cubs and puppies grow. Little ones of either gender at the Saving Puppies Center. Cows, cats, dogs, whole flocks, we will let coyotes adopt. We can't leave these babies alone. Babies deserve a loving home. Coyotes love a tasty meal. Turn baby calves into veal. Stand-Up Bear had a big personality, so he tried his luck with late-night comedy. Telling jokes was his craft. He made lions and hyenas laugh. Animals would watch with glee to hear the truths that he would speak. Bunnies, puppies, things that moo, coyotes turn them into stew. How can animals be such dupes? Coyotes just want piglet soups. Stand-Up Bear got many laughs for his defense of a little calf. The next day, the local roosters reported Stand-Up Bear's a loser. We must silence this loudmouth yuppie. He is against saving puppies. All who challenge the Saving Puppies Center must have their thought crimes censored. Tell the bear he must leave. He can't do stand-up comedy. Stand-Up Bear was not deterred. He called the local mountain bluebirds. Carry my message as far as you reach. Carry my message with tweets, tweets, tweets. The bluebirds flew all over the farm, tweet by tweet to sound the alarm. Don't trust the roosters, they think they are slick. Roosters are animals of deceptions and tricks. The roosters reported, the bear's anti-bird. We can't let him speak such dangerous words. He talks about turning calves into veal. How does that make farm animals feel? The time has come to limit his reach. No longer can he send such insensitive tweets. Stand-Up Bear refused to back down. He spread his message all over town. He wrote his jokes for all that would look. He put his face on the front of a book. Facebook. Who lies around all day and is really fat? None other than Charisma Cat. The bear's message was taking its toll, so the cat called on the garden trolls. The trolls proclaimed, the bear is bad! To alert the farm, they put up red flags. Foolish animals just didn't learn. They cheered as the bear's Facebook burned. Stand-Up Bear had another move. He took his jokes to the Me and YouTube. Hey guys, did you hear that rat? Oh wait, that's Charisma Cat. Who lives with their mom but wants to sacrifice foals? Just your average garden trolls. The school of fish was instructed to teach that Stand-Up Bear was spewing hate speech. Or did she just hate his speech? No more talk of stew and soup. Coyotes are a protected group. The bears will pay for the words they have used. He is now banned from the Me and YouTube. Control their speech, control their minds. Gold and power will be mine, all mine. Many animals ignored what was true and instead decided to signal virtue. The bears didn't listen, as other animals did. The goats would sacrifice all of their kids. Cows, alpaca, and roly-poly handed their children to hungry coyote. Stand-Up Bear continued to crush, and he told his jokes at breakfast and lunch. Nothing can stop him from speaking the truth, and his message is now reaching the youth. Speak truth that others would not dare, and you too will be a stand-up bear. You see, Because of the First Amendment, the government can't directly limit our speech. That's because of what these guys did, what they accomplished. But what they do today is they convince these businesses, right, through a variety of different means, right? But they convince Twitter and Facebook and YouTube and TikTok. These are businesses, right? And they have them limit our speech. Now, we're going to study more about this in the future, because what you'll find is that although it appears these are private businesses, they are very much intertwined with the government today. But that's a talk for another day. See, they accuse Stand Up Bear of hate speech. Who determines what hate speech is? Someone who hates your speech? They said he's anti-bird. I've been called anti a few things in my life. Always be careful of people who want to silence others. Because what they really want to silence, a lot of the time, is the argument of others.